Maria Yazzie stepped out of her truck and felt the familiar crunch of desert sand beneath her boots. The morning sun painted the red rocks of the San Carlos Apache Reservation in shades of gold and crimson. At 28, she had the steady eyes of someone who had learned to see what others missed. Her grandmother always said that the earth spoke to those who listened. Today, something was definitely speaking. She was here because of a phone call from her cousin Jake the night before. His voice had been tight with worry. "Maria, you need to see something. Meet me at Dry Creek Canyon tomorrow morning, early." Jake was waiting by his pickup, his face grim. He pointed toward a cluster of cottonwood trees near the creek bed. "Over there. Someone's been dumping again." Maria followed him through the brush, pushing aside branches that caught at her field jacket. The smell hit her first. Chemical, sharp, wrong. Then she saw the barrels, 20, maybe 30 metal drums scattered among the trees like giant silver mushrooms. Some were rusted through, their contents seeping into the soil in dark stains. "How long has this been here?" she asked, pulling out her phone to take pictures. "I found it 3 days ago while checking fence lines. This is fresh. These weren't here last month." Maria knelt beside one of the leaking barrels. The label was partially burned off, but she could make out enough to know this was industrial waste, probably from the mining company that operated just outside the reservation boundary. Phoenix Copper had been expanding their operations, and reservation lands made for convenient dumping when no one was watching. "Jake, this is bad. Really bad. This stuff could be getting into the groundwater." Her cousin nodded grimly. "I called the tribal environmental office. They said they'd look into it. That was 3 days ago." Maria stood, brushing dirt from her knees. She worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs as an environmental scientist, but her real expertise was in water quality. She knew exactly how dangerous this could be for the community. The creek fed into the reservation's main water supply. If these chemicals reached the aquifer, dozens of families could be affected. "I'm taking samples," she decided. "This can't wait for bureaucrats to figure out their next meeting." She returned to her truck and pulled out her sampling kit. As she worked, collecting soil and water samples in labeled vials, she thought about her grandmother's stories. The old woman had lived through the government's forced relocations, the boarding schools that tried to erase Apache culture, the decades of promises broken. "Sometimes," her grandmother had told her, "when the system fails us, we must become the system." That afternoon, Maria sat in her small office at the BIA building in Phoenix, staring at the preliminary test results on her computer screen. The numbers made her stomach clench. Heavy metals, industrial solvents, compounds that had no business being anywhere near a water source. She picked up her phone and called her supervisor. "Tom, we have a situation at San Carlos. Illegal dumping, and the contamination levels are off the charts." Tom Morrison's voice came through the speaker with his usual bureaucratic caution. "How off the charts?" "Lead levels alone are 10 times the EPA safe limit. There's also benzene, trichloroethylene, and some compounds I haven't identified yet. This is major contamination." Okay. Let me check the protocols. We'll need to file reports with the EPA, notify tribal authorities, probably get the FBI involved if it's illegal dumping. This could take months to sort out properly." "Months?" Maria felt her voice rise. "Tom, people are drinking this water now. Kids are playing in that creek." "I understand your concern, Maria, but we have procedures. We can't just go running around making accusations against major corporations without following proper channels." After she hung up, Maria sat back in her chair, frustrated. She had been working for the BIA for 5 years. Long enough to know that proper channels often meant nothing happens. She had seen environmental disasters drag on for years while lawyers argued and politicians made promises they never kept. She thought about Phoenix Copper's gleaming headquarters downtown, with its marble lobby and awards for community partnership. She thought about the reservation, where her Aunt Sarah raised her 3 children in a double-wide trailer, and worried about money for groceries. Two different worlds, with very different definitions of what mattered. That evening, Maria drove back to the reservation to visit her grandmother. Elena Yazzie was 84 years old and still sharp as the obsidian tools their ancestors had used. She lived in a small adobe house her late husband had built, surrounded by the garden where she grew traditional medicines. "You look troubled, granddaughter," the old woman said as Maria sat down at her kitchen table. Maria explained about the dumping, the contamination, the bureaucratic delays. Her grandmother listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of understanding. "What do you think I should do?" Maria asked finally. Elena was quiet for a long moment, stirring her tea. "When I was your age, the government men came and told us we couldn't practice our ceremonies anymore. They said it was the law, that we had to follow their ways. Do you know what we did?" Maria shook her head, though she suspected she knew the answer. "We went into the mountains at night. We kept our traditions alive when no one was watching. Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing are not the same thing." "But grandmother, I could lose my job. They could prosecute me if I act without authorization." The old woman reached across the table and took Maria's hands in her weathered ones. "Child, our people have survived worse than losing jobs. We've survived genocide, relocation, cultural destruction. We survived because we did what needed to be done, not what we were told to do." That night, Maria lay awake in her apartment in Phoenix, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the test results, about the children who played near Dry Creek, about her cousin Jake's worried face. She thought about her grandmother's words and the weight of responsibility that came with knowledge. The next morning, she made her decision. She called in sick to work and drove back to the reservation. This time, she brought more than sampling equipment. She brought her camera, her GPS unit, and a determination that surprised her with its intensity. She spent the morning documenting everything. She photographed each barrel, recorded GPS coordinates, took extensive soil and water samples from multiple locations. She followed the contamination trail upstream and found where it entered the creek system. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. But as she worked, she wasn't alone. A white pickup truck sat on the ridge overlooking the canyon, too far away to see the occupants clearly. It had been there for an hour, just watching. Maria felt the prickle of awareness that comes from being observed, but she didn't let it stop her work. She was photographing a particularly damaged barrel when she heard the truck engine start up. Instead of leaving, it was coming down into the canyon. Maria quickly packed her equipment and walked back toward her own truck, trying to look casual. The white pickup pulled up beside her as she reached her vehicle. Two men got out. They were dressed like ranch hands, but something about them felt wrong. Too clean, too purposeful. "Afternoon, miss," the taller one said. His voice was polite, but his eyes were cold. "You doing some kind of research out here?" "Just taking pictures," Maria replied evenly. "Beautiful country." "Yeah, it sure is. Of course, some folks might say this is private land. Might not be safe for tourists to wander around alone." Maria met his gaze steadily. "Actually, this is reservation land. Has been for over a century." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Is that right?" "Well, sometimes boundaries get a little unclear out here in the desert. Easy to get lost, if you know what I mean." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Maria felt her heart rate increase, but she kept her voice calm. "I know exactly where I am, and exactly what I've seen." She got into her truck and started the engine. As she drove away, she watched the men in her rearview mirror. They stood beside their truck for a long time, talking on cell phones. That evening, Maria sat at her computer organizing the evidence she had collected. The photographs were clear and damning. The chemical analysis results spoke for themselves. She had enough proof to bring down Phoenix Copper's illegal operation, but she needed to be smart about how she used it. She thought about her grandmother's words again. Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing weren't the same. Sometimes you had to act when no one else would. She picked up her phone and dialed the number for the Phoenix environmental reporter at the Arizona Republic. If the government wouldn't listen, maybe the media would. Hello, this is Dave Chen. Mr. Chen, my name is Maria Yazzie. I'm an environmental scientist, and I have proof that Phoenix Copper is illegally dumping toxic waste on the San Carlos Apache Reservation. There was a pause. That's a serious accusation. What kind of proof? Chemical analysis, photographs, GPS coordinates, contamination levels that would make your hair curl, but it needs to move fast. I think they know someone's watching. Can you meet tomorrow? I'd like to see everything you have. Yes, but not in Phoenix. Too visible. There's a diner in Globe called Elena's. Meet me there at 10 in the morning. After she hung up, Maria felt a mixture of fear and excitement. She was crossing a line, moving from government employee following protocols to activist taking direct action. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. She thought about her grandmother's stories again, about Apache warriors who protected their people by any means necessary. The tactics were different now, but the principle was the same. When your people were threatened, you acted. You didn't wait for permission. The next morning, she was supposed to be at work, filing reports and following procedures. Instead, she was driving toward Globe with a folder full of evidence that could change everything. In her rearview mirror, she noticed the same white pickup truck that had appeared in the canyon. She smiled grimly and pressed down on the accelerator. "No one is watching?" she murmured to herself, echoing the phrase that had been running through her mind. "Let's do what must be done." The game was just beginning, but Maria Yazzie was ready to play. Her ancestors had fought for their survival with bows and rifles. She would fight with chemistry reports and investigative journalism. Different weapons, same war. As she drove through the desert morning, with the sun painting the mountains in shades of hope and determination, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in years working for the government. She felt like she was finally doing something that mattered, something her grandmother would be proud of. The white pickup was still following, but that was okay. Let them watch. What they would see was a young Apache woman who refused to be intimidated, who understood that sometimes the most important battles were fought by people willing to stand alone. The diner in Globe was just ahead. Time to see if courage was contagious. Dave Chen was already waiting at Elena's diner when Maria arrived. She recognized him immediately from his newspaper photo, a young Asian-American man with wire-rimmed glasses and the slightly rumpled look of someone who spent too much time chasing stories. He stood up as she approached his corner booth. "Miss Yazzie?" "Just Maria." She slid into the seat across from him, noting that he had chosen a spot with a view of both the entrance and the parking lot. "You've done this before." "Environmental stories can get complicated," he said with a slight smile, "especially when they involve major corporations and tribal lands. Can I see what you've got?" Maria opened her folder and spread the contents across the table. Chemical analysis reports, photographs of the dumping site, GPS coordinates, water contamination data. Dave's expression grew more serious as he reviewed each piece of evidence. "This is incredible," he said finally, "and incredibly damning. These contamination levels, how many people are at risk? Direct exposure? Maybe 300 families who rely on that water system, but if it reaches the main aquifer, we're talking about thousands." Dave pulled out a small recorder. "Do you mind? I want to make sure I get this right." For the next hour, Maria walked him through everything she had discovered. She explained the timeline, the bureaucratic delays, the threats she had received. Dave asked good questions, the kind that showed he understood both the science and the politics involved. "What's your supervisor saying about all this?" he asked. "He wants to follow protocols. Could take months or years before anything happens." Meanwhile, kids are swimming in contaminated water. And you're willing to go on the record? This could end your career with the BIA. Maria thought about her grandmother's words, about doing what needed to be done when no one was watching. Some things are more important than careers. After Dave left to start working on his story, Maria stayed at the diner, drinking coffee and watching the parking lot through the window. The white pickup hadn't followed her inside, but she had seen it parked across the street when she arrived. Now it was gone. Her phone rang. Tom Morrison's name appeared on the screen. "Maria, where are you? You called in sick, but Jim Henderson from Phoenix Copper says you were seen taking unauthorized samples on their property yesterday." "Their property?" Maria felt her anger flare. "Tom, that's reservation land. Has been since 1871. Look, I'm getting pressure from upstairs. Phoenix Copper is claiming you're harassing them, trespassing, making false accusations. They've filed a formal complaint." "What kind of pressure?" Tom's voice dropped. "The kind that comes from companies that donate heavily to political campaigns. Maria, you need to back off this. Come in tomorrow and we'll discuss a reassignment. Maybe something in water management, away from enforcement." "A reassignment? Tom, we have proof of illegal dumping that's threatening public health, and you want to reassign me?" "I want to protect your career. And frankly, I want to protect this department. We can't afford to make enemies of major corporations without ironclad legal backing." After Tom hung up, Maria sat staring at her phone. The system was working exactly as it was designed to work. Phoenix Copper had more lawyers than the entire BIA environmental department. They had political connections, lobbying power, and deep pockets. What they didn't have was the truth. But in Maria's experience, truth was often the weakest weapon in these battles. She drove back to Phoenix that afternoon, taking a circuitous route and checking her mirrors frequently. The white pickup didn't reappear, but she had the persistent feeling of being watched. When she stopped for gas, she noticed a black sedan that seemed to follow the same route. When she changed lanes, it changed lanes. When she took an unexpected exit, it took the same exit. By the time she reached her apartment building, her nerves were stretched tight. She parked in the underground garage and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. As the doors opened, she nearly collided with a man in an expensive suit who was waiting in the hallway. "Ms. Yazzie, I'm Robert Harrison from Phoenix Copper's legal department. I was hoping we could have a brief conversation." Maria stepped back into the elevator, keeping her finger on the door-open button. "About what?" "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Our company has always maintained excellent environmental standards. If there's some concern about our operations, we'd be happy to address it through proper channels." "Proper channels like dumping toxic waste on tribal lands?" Harrison's smile never wavered. "I think you've been given some bad information. Phoenix Copper operates strictly within federal guidelines. We've won awards for our environmental stewardship. I have photographic evidence and chemical analysis that says otherwise. Photographs can be misleading. Chemical tests can be contaminated or misinterpreted. What matters is following established procedures for addressing concerns." He stepped closer to the elevator. "Ms. Yazzie, you seem like a bright young woman with a promising career. It would be unfortunate if false accusations damaged that career unnecessarily." Maria let the elevator doors close between them. As the car descended, her hands were shaking. The message was clear: back off or face consequences. But instead of intimidating her, the encounter had the opposite effect. It confirmed that Phoenix Copper was worried, which meant her evidence was solid. That evening, she called her cousin Jake. "I need you to do something for me. Can you organize some of the tribal council members to visit the dumping site? Take pictures, document everything. If something happens to my evidence, we need backup." "Something like what?" "Like my apartment being searched, my computer being hacked, my samples being lost. These people play hardball." "Maria, maybe you should let the tribal authorities handle this now. You've done enough." "Have I?" "Jake, nothing's changed. Those barrels are still there. That contamination is still spreading. All I've done is make some people uncomfortable." The next morning, Maria didn't go to work. Instead, she drove to the San Carlos reservation and spent the day meeting with tribal leaders, explaining the situation, showing them her evidence. The reaction was immediate and angry. Within hours, the tribal council had called an emergency session. That afternoon, she received a text from Dave Chen. "Story runs tomorrow morning, front page." But at 9 o'clock that evening, her phone rang again. "Maria, this is Dave. We've got a problem. Phoenix Copper's lawyers served an injunction. They're claiming your evidence was obtained illegally, that the contamination claims are unsubstantiated. My editor is pulling the story pending legal review." Maria felt like she had been punched in the stomach. How long will that take? Could be weeks, maybe months. They've got a team of lawyers working on this. After Dave hung up, Maria sat in her car in the parking lot of a convenience store, feeling defeated. Phoenix Copper had just demonstrated the power of money and legal intimidation. They could suppress the story, discredit her evidence, and probably destroy her career in the process. She thought about giving up, following Tom's advice to take a reassignment and let someone else fight this battle. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as she sat there, she remembered her grandmother's stories about survival, about doing what was necessary even when the odds were impossible. She started her car and drove toward the reservation. If the media wouldn't tell the story, she would find another way. At midnight, she was back at Dry Creek Canyon with Jake and 12 members of the tribal council. They brought floodlights, cameras, and sampling equipment. If Phoenix Copper wanted to play legal games, fine. But they were about to discover that tribal sovereignty meant something. "This is our land," said Robert Casador, the council chairman. "We don't need permission from federal courts to protect our own territory." They worked through the night, documenting everything. Maria supervised the water and soil sampling while tribal members photographed every barrel, every contamination site, every piece of evidence Phoenix Copper's lawyers were trying to suppress. As dawn broke over the desert, Maria felt a familiar sense of determination. Phoenix Copper thought they could intimidate a government employee. They were about to learn the difference between a government employee and an Apache woman defending her people's homeland. "What happens now?" Jake asked, as they loaded the last of the samples into coolers. "Now we go to war," Maria replied, "but we do it Apache style." She had been fighting by their rules, using their systems, following their procedures. That was over. Phoenix Copper had just taught her that sometimes the most effective action happened when no one was watching, when no one expected it, when the established powers assumed they had won. By noon, Maria was at the tribal radio station, going live on a program that broadcast to reservations across the Southwest. She had photos, test results, and a story that couldn't be suppressed by corporate lawyers. "This is Maria Yazzie, and I want to tell you about Phoenix Copper's war on Apache children." Her phone started ringing before the broadcast was finished. Reporters from tribal newspapers, environmental groups, lawyers offering to help. Phoenix Copper had tried to silence one voice and accidentally created a movement. That afternoon, she received a call from Tom Morrison. "Maria, you're fired. Effective immediately. Insubordination, unauthorized disclosure of confidential information, working outside your authority. Security will escort you out when you come to collect your things." "Understood," she said calmly. "That's it? No arguing? No pleading to keep your job?" "Tom, did you ever wonder why the contamination report took so long to process? Why the proper channels never seem to work for problems on tribal lands?" "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you that Phoenix Copper has been dumping on reservation land for months. I'm telling you that federal agencies look the other way." And I'm telling you that this story is just getting started." She hung up and looked around her apartment, thinking about the choice she had made. Tomorrow, she would be unemployed, probably unemployable in federal service. Phoenix Copper's lawyers would try to destroy her credibility and possibly pursue criminal charges. But tonight, 300 Apache families had clean water because someone was watching. Tonight, children would swim in Dry Creek without absorbing industrial toxins. Tonight, the truth was spreading faster than Phoenix Copper's lawyers could contain it. Her grandmother had been right. Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing were not the same. Sometimes the most important work happened when no one was watching, when the powerful assumed they were safe from consequences. Maria Yazzie had just proven them wrong. 6 weeks after Maria lost her federal job, she stood in the same spot at Dry Creek Canyon where she had first discovered the toxic dumping. But everything had changed. Where 20 metal barrels had once leaked poison into the soil, there were now cleanup crews in hazmat suits carefully excavating contaminated earth. Where Phoenix Copper's illegal waste had threatened the water supply, there were now testing stations monitoring every drop that flowed downstream. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. It had taken lawyers, protests, media coverage, and political pressure from a dozen tribal nations to force action. But it had worked. "Miss Yazzie?" Maria turned to see a young woman with a press badge and a camera crew behind her. Sarah B. Gay from Native News Network had been following the story since Maria's first tribal radio broadcast. "How does it feel to see this cleanup finally happening?" Sarah asked, positioning her microphone between them. Maria looked at the cleanup crews, then at the clear water running in the creek bed. "It feels like justice. But more than that, it feels like proof that our voices matter when we refuse to be silenced." The story of what had happened at Dry Creek had become bigger than anyone expected. Maria's tribal radio broadcast had been picked up by other stations, then by environmental groups, then by mainstream media. The photographs and chemical analysis that Phoenix Copper's lawyers had tried to suppress became the centerpiece of a federal investigation. But the real breakthrough had come when other tribes started reporting similar problems. Illegal dumping wasn't limited to San Carlos. Phoenix Copper had been treating reservation lands across the Southwest as convenient disposal sites, assuming that tribal governments lacked the resources or political power to fight back. They had miscalculated badly. The EPA investigation found contamination at 7 different sites, Maria continued for the camera. Phoenix Copper will pay over $50 million in fines and cleanup costs. But more important than the money is the precedent. No company can assume that tribal lands are unprotected anymore. After the interview, Maria walked back to her truck, past the sign's warning of ongoing remediation work. Her phone buzzed with a text from her grandmother. "Proud of you, granddaughter. Come for dinner tonight." The past 6 weeks had been a whirlwind of legal depositions, media interviews, and congressional hearings. Maria had testified before a House subcommittee on environmental justice, her grandmother's turquoise bracelet on her wrist for strength. She had watched Phoenix Copper executives squirm under questioning about their disposal practices and community engagement policies. But the personal cost had been significant. She was unemployable in federal service, blacklisted by most major consulting firms that did government work. Her savings were nearly gone, and she was living on odd jobs and the generosity of friends and family. Still, she had no regrets. Her phone rang as she drove toward town. Dave Chen's name appeared on the screen. "Maria, I have news. The Pulitzer Committee just announced this year's nominees for investigative reporting. My Phoenix Copper series made the list." "Congratulations, Dave. You deserve that recognition." "We deserved it. None of this would have happened without your courage to go public when the federal system failed." "Any word on the criminal charges against Phoenix Copper executives?" "The federal prosecutor is moving forward with criminal charges for violations of the Clean Water Act and conspiracy to violate civil rights." Your evidence is the foundation of the entire case. After Dave hung up, Maria continued driving through the desert, thinking about the unexpected turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been a government scientist following protocols and filing reports. Now she was something else entirely. An activist, maybe. A whistleblower. A troublemaker who refused to let powerful people hide their crimes behind bureaucratic procedure. That evening at her grandmother's house, Elena had prepared traditional food: fry bread, venison stew, and the wild greens she gathered in the mountains. They ate in comfortable silence while the sun set behind the peaks. "You look tired, granddaughter," Elena said finally. "I am tired. But also, I don't know what comes next. I can't go back to my old job. Most environmental groups can't afford to hire me full-time. I've been thinking about leaving Arizona altogether, starting over somewhere new." Elena was quiet for a moment, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "Do you remember the story I told you about the woman warrior who fought with Geronimo?" Maria nodded. Lozin had been her grandmother's favorite historical figure, an Apache woman who could sense enemy movements and who fought alongside the last free Apache bands. After Geronimo surrendered, Lozin spent years in prison in Florida, far from her homeland. The government thought they had broken her spirit, but when she finally returned to the Southwest, she became a teacher, a healer, a keeper of our traditions. She found a different way to fight for her people. "What are you saying, grandmother?" "I'm saying that warriors take many forms. Sometimes they carry rifles, sometimes they carry test tubes and cameras. Sometimes they work inside the system, sometimes they work outside it, but they never stop fighting for what matters." 3 days later, Maria received a phone call that changed everything. Dr. Patricia Running Bear from the University of Arizona Law School was launching a new environmental justice clinic focused on tribal sovereignty issues. She wanted Maria to help run it. "We need someone who understands both the science and the politics," Patricia explained during their meeting in Tucson. "Someone who's not afraid to challenge powerful interests when tribal communities are threatened." "I don't have a law degree," Maria pointed out. "You have something more valuable. You have credibility with tribal communities and a track record of getting results. We can teach you the law. What we can't teach is the courage to act when no one else will." The position would allow Maria to work on environmental threats across Indian country, providing technical expertise and advocacy for tribes that lacked resources to fight corporate contamination on their own. It was a chance to turn her experience at Dry Creek into a broader movement for environmental justice. "There's one condition," Patricia added. "The position requires you to testify before Congress at least twice a year about environmental threats on tribal lands. Phoenix Copper has a lot of friends in Washington. They'll try to discredit you, attack your credibility, make your life difficult." Maria thought about the white pickup truck, the corporate lawyers in expensive suits, the attempts to silence her through intimidation. She thought about the children swimming in Dry Creek, the families who had been unknowingly exposed to industrial toxins, the pattern of environmental racism that treated tribal lands as sacrifice zones. "When do I start?" she asked. 6 months later, Maria stood in a congressional hearing room facing a panel of senators and representatives. The Phoenix Copper case had become a touchstone for environmental justice advocates, and Congress was finally paying attention to the broader pattern of corporate abuse on tribal lands. "Ms. Yazzie," said the committee chairman, "you've become something of a controversial figure. Critics say you're an activist who uses scare tactics to attack legitimate businesses. How do you respond to that?" Maria looked out at the packed hearing room, where she could see tribal leaders from across the country, environmental activists, and yes, Phoenix Copper executives and their lawyers. She thought about her grandmother's words, about finding different ways to fight for what mattered. "Senator, I'm a scientist who believes that children shouldn't be poisoned for corporate profits. If that makes me controversial, I'm comfortable with that." She opened her folder and pulled out a photograph. This is Dry Creek before Phoenix Copper started dumping there. Clear water, healthy fish, families swimming and playing. She held up a second photograph. This is Dry Creek after 2 years of illegal dumping. Dead fish, contaminated sediment, warning signs telling people to stay away from water their families had used safely for generations. She looked directly at the Phoenix Copper executives sitting in the front row. The only thing controversial about this case is that it took so long for anyone to hold Phoenix Copper accountable. During the lunch break, Maria stepped outside the Capitol building and called her grandmother. Elena was now 85 and rarely left the reservation, but she followed every detail of Maria's work through phone calls and newspaper articles. "How did it go this morning?" Elena asked. "Good, I think. They're listening now. That's more than we had a year ago." "You sound tired again." "It's hard work, grandmother. Sometimes I wonder if I'm making any real difference. Phoenix Copper paid their fines, but there are dozens of other companies doing the same things. The problems are so big." Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you remember what you told that reporter when the cleanup started? You said it felt like proof that our voices matter when we refuse to be silenced." "I remember." "That's the difference you're making, granddaughter. Not just stopping one company, but proving that we can fight back. Other young people see what you did and know it's possible. Other communities see that they don't have to accept pollution and contamination as the price of being poor or native or powerless." That afternoon, during the final session of the hearing, something unexpected happened. Senator Williams, who had been one of Phoenix Copper's strongest defenders, asked Maria a question that surprised everyone. "Ms. Yazzie, if you were in charge of federal environmental policy for tribal lands, what would you change?" It was an opening Maria hadn't expected. She took a breath and spoke from her heart. "Senator, I would start with the assumption that tribal sovereignty means something. That tribal communities have the right to clean air and water just like any other American community. I would require meaningful consultation before any industrial activity near tribal lands, and I would make sure that environmental enforcement agencies work for the people they're supposed to protect, not for the companies they're supposed to regulate." 6 months after that hearing, Congress passed the Tribal Environmental Protection Act, requiring federal agencies to prioritize environmental justice in tribal communities and providing new funding for tribal environmental programs. It wasn't everything Maria had hoped for, but it was progress. 2 years after she first discovered the illegal dumping at Dry Creek, Maria stood again in the canyon where it all began. The cleanup was complete, the water was clean, and families were swimming in the creek again. But more important than the physical restoration was what had changed in less visible ways. The Apache Nation now had its own environmental monitoring program, with young tribal members trained to detect and respond to environmental threats. Other tribes had established similar programs. The pattern of corporate environmental racism that had treated tribal lands as dumping grounds was finally being challenged systematically. Maria's phone rang. Another tribal environmental director from Montana, reporting possible contamination near the Blackfeet Reservation. Another case, another fight, another chance to prove that when no one was watching, someone still cared enough to act. "I'll be there tomorrow," she told the caller. "Bring water samples and GPS coordinates. We'll figure out who's responsible and how to stop them." As she walked back to her truck, Maria thought about the phrase that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her fight with Phoenix Copper. "No one is watching. Let's do what must be done." It had started as a recognition that environmental crimes flourished in darkness and secrecy. It had become a battle cry for transparency and accountability. Now, people were watching. Communities were organized. Young people understood that they didn't have to accept injustice as inevitable. The work was far from finished, but the game had changed. Companies could no longer assume that tribal lands were unprotected, that environmental crimes would go unnoticed, that powerful interests could silence inconvenient voices. Maria Yazzie had learned to fight like her ancestors, adapting to new weapons and new battlefields but never losing sight of what mattered most, protecting the people and the land that sustained them. It wasn't the career she had planned, but it was the life she had chosen. And somewhere in the mountains, an 85-year-old Apache woman smiled and told her neighbors that her granddaughter was still making trouble for people who deserved it.